I'm Walter Podrazik, television curator at the Museum of Broadcast Communications in Chicago. I'm here in our downtown studios with my co-author of the book Watching TV, 6 Decades of American Television, Harry Castleman. Harry Castleman is an attorney in Boston at McKenzie & Sawin. He's been a career-long collaborator on books we've written about popular culture, beginning with the Beatles and all together now. But the book we're most proud of is Watching TV, 6 Decades of American Television. It's the season-by-season chronicle, the story of television from the beginning to the present day. In fact, we're working on an updated edition right now for 2016. Harry Castleman, welcome to the Museum of Broadcast Communications.
Thanks, Wally. I appreciate you inviting me to come here and see the wonderful place you have here.
This is the first time you've been here.
Yes, it is. I've heard a lot about it, but this is my first visit.
And the rare thing about Harry Castleman and myself is that the two of us are rarely in the same city at the same time. And so since we had this rare opportunity, why not take advantage of sharing some thoughts about watching TV here at the museum?
Yes, indeed.
All right, Harry, watching TV. What's some of your earliest memories of watching TV, and how did that lead to wanting to do this book with me, The History of Television?
It's, of course, difficult to remember my first memory of television, but the earliest things I can recall all tend to be sports related. Being born in 1953, my first real recollection is the famous, I guess it was 1958, New York Giants Baltimore Colts NFL championship game, where the Colts beat the Giants at the end, and we watched, my brother and I, who was older than me, we watched that together. I remember that. I remember running home after school to watch the 1959 Chicago White Sox Los Angeles Dodgers World Series game.
Sad moment.
Yes, of course, that's when World Series games were still in daytime. And I remember the 1960 Winter Olympics, broadcast live by CBS from Squaw Valley, California, when the United States beat the Soviet Union in hockey. And just as the winning goal was scored, my brother and I started squabbling with each other, and we missed the goal. And of course, there was no instant replay at that time, so the entire family was very mad at us.
Well, one of my earliest memories of television actually is of the Honeymooners. I have no idea why, but because my parents told me, oh, you used to watch this, you used to watch that. No memory of that at all. But the Honeymooners, I did remember, and it was not necessarily because I thought Jackie Gleason was the greatest actor in the world. Art Carney was incredibly hilarious. I loved the music. As a kid, I realized that sometimes my choice of a show would be because of the theme song. I'd be in, hang around a little bit at the beginning, maybe I'd drift off, do something else, and then come back and hear the closing theme song. Because to me, that was a real good hook for what television had to offer, which was something upbeat, something pleasant, something musical.
Well, I never knew this about you, Wally, because as you know, we both love The Honeymooners, one of our favorite shows. I happen to think The Honeymooners theme song is really pretty bland, and never really was very effective in my mind, but hey, it's a good show.
And that's one of those rare moments when we disagree.
Yes.
And that basically is the setup for what I wanted to ask you about, or let's talk a little bit about the book, Watching TV. It's a book we're proud of, but it's also a book that we're proud to have researched. And I think you've stated pretty directly why you thought it was important to do a book like that. And let's set the context. We're talking about, eventually, the first edition was published in the early 80s. So this was a project that we began in basically the tail end of the first great era of television, which would be broadcasting.
Well, I was always interested in television as a kid. I guess I watched a lot of television. I didn't feel like I watched a huge amount, but who knows? And being a person who's interested in history in general, I was attracted to the concept of the history of television because it was before my time, and I didn't know what came before my time. I remember at one point when I was in high school, maybe, and was thinking, gee, I wonder if I could put together a list of like all the fall preview, the fall schedules of all the seasons that had been on television. And I kind of sat down one afternoon and started trying to figure out how I would do that, and very, very quickly reached the conclusion that that was far beyond the ability I had then to research it as a high schooler. But the thought always stuck with me. And so later on, when you and I, after we had done some books on the Beatles, we were trying to decide what to do next, and the thought of a book about television history always attracted me because, and again we're talking now in the late 70s, there was virtually nothing on the history of television in print. There were a couple of books. They tended to be a little bit more academic or focusing mostly on the industry itself and the technical aspects of it, which are very valuable and helpful. But our point of view was, yes, you have to tell that aspect of the story, but gee, to the viewer, the home viewer, the most important figure, the aspect of television is what's on television, why you watch television. And so we thought that why isn't there a book that tells the story of both, of the background, the industry, the technical nature of television, but also what was on television. And so we sat down to write this thinking that we can't believe no one's done this yet, and kept thinking that somebody was going to come out and do it and beat us to the punch. And nobody did beat us to the punch, and you know, what is it, 30 years later, no, still nobody's beaten us to the punch.
Well, what was most striking about it is we instantly knew how the story had to be told. That's one of the shortest book planning conferences that we've ever had. I mean, it took 30 seconds because I think we both instantly knew exactly what had to be told. The little niggling point was getting sufficient information to be able to accurately tell that story. And also something as simple as, where do you start? And appropriate to this museum, the Museum of Broadcasting, our lower floor is radio, this floor is television that we're on with the studio right now. And it became obvious very quickly that if you want to understand television, you have to understand radio. And to understand radio, you have to go back.
Yes, I mean, you know, at the beginning, I kind of smugly felt, well, I'm familiar with a lot of the big hits of TV from before my time. I knew about Milton Berle and, you know, I Love Lucy. And, you know, surely I could tell this story, you and I could tell this story without a great deal of effort. Well, of course, that wasn't the case. Fortunately, we were living in Washington at that time, and we're very close to the Library of Congress. And we spent days, weeks, months, I don't remember now how long.
It was almost a year.
Almost a year, going to the Library of Congress and digging into their repertoire of material, of old magazines, newspapers, industry reports. I remember we found the actual bound copies of the Nielsen TV ratings digests that came out that would go to the industry, and of course it listed exactly what was on network television at what time and so forth, which helped us put together the schedules.
The schedules that you'd always dreamed of doing.
That I always dreamed of doing, and wound up, at least for the fall season, in watching TV, because as you pointed out at the beginning, how we structured the book was going season by season. A chapter for the 1950-51 season, for the 51-52 season, and so forth. And so that kind of fell into place. But then, as you said, telling the story of how we got there. How did TV start? And obviously you get into radio, and how did radio start? And so we loved it. We immersed ourselves in looking up history in the Library of Congress, to finding out, you know, how had the radio networks begun? Where had they come from? How had radio broadcasting begun? How had the NBC, CBS, where did ABC come from? I didn't realize that ABC had come as an offshoot of NBC when NBC had two radio networks. I never really knew that there was a Dumont television network that existed in the old days. And finding out about it and finding out where it came from and where it went and how it died, the concept at that time of a TV network dying was incomprehensible. There was no such thing. TV networks always existed. They lived forever. There was no such thing as a TV network dying. And so I became fascinated with, well, how did the Dumont network die? What happened? Did they have like a sign-off in which they said, that's it, we're done, goodbye, go home? And of course, it didn't really work out that way. It sort of petered out, but it was fascinating to research that. And trying to put that all together was like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, which was great fun, and we learned a lot, and then passed that information on to the readers.
And one of the aspects that I'm particularly proud of is the joy of telling the story. You had mentioned that there have been other books, some academically, purely academically oriented, focusing on the industry. When they focused on the industry, they tended to be almost dismissive of the programming. That is, well, this is like beneath us to talk about. Let's talk about the money-making aspect. Let's talk about the technological breakthroughs. But we could not ignore the joy of being a television watcher, because people don't watch networks, don't want to disillusion them. They don't come in and say, boy, I sure hope ABC does well this year. It's, I want to see the latest episodes of my favorite series. But beyond that, the joy of telling the story that we ourselves were coming across for the first time. And you don't immediately notice this unless we point it out, but we set ourselves an interesting discipline, which was we weren't going to cheat on the story. That is, it's a season by season, forward progressing story. And for instance, if you read a typical write-up about the quiz show scandal of the 1950s, you introduce the concept of quiz shows and immediately it's scandal. No, it wasn't a scandal if it started out as a scandal. No one was betrayed, no one was disillusioned. So when we tell the story, we give quiz shows a chance to shine, to be the most popular format on television, to be something that people were thoroughly engaged in, who loved the contestants, who loved the competition.
And first, you have to tell the story, as you say, you have to show the rise of quiz shows and how quiz shows made the networks get rid of some of the public affairs programming. See It Now, the famous program from Edward R. Murrow on CBS, it had been a primetime series on Tuesday nights, I think, until the $64,000 question suddenly came on, and then the time slot that See It Now had became too valuable for CBS, and they kicked See It Now to Sunday afternoon, the so-called egghead slot.
That was before football took over Sunday afternoon.
That's right, when Dumont was still broadcasting Sunday football. And the quiz shows came on and took over a lot of primetime programming. So you have to set that up. That's why the networks felt they had to rig the shows, because they were so popular, they couldn't risk losing the individual contestants who were successful and appealing. That's why they rigged it. So you have to tell that story in an ascending order, and then you've got the fall and what happens and the impact that that has on other programming coming up in the future.
And of course, the they in the rigging is always people looking another direction. In other words, you don't have these planning meetings saying, let's rig this so that we maximize our return. Let's make sure that everything that should happen does happen. Let's make it possible for the most popular contestants to return again and again. Though a quote, and again, it was wonderful coming across quotes that illustrated the points, where I believe we quote some contestant in saying, well, I received help only an idiot wouldn't understand, in terms of explaining how they made sure it went smoothly.
But you know, another thing that I loved about the researching part was, since of course at that time we had, as most researchers do, you know the future, you know what's going to happen, you know what's important. And so when you're digging through old material and you find some little 5-line reference to a strange disc jockey in Trenton, New Jersey named Ernie Kovacs, your eyes jump to it and say, oh, that's what Ernie Kovacs was doing before he became a star on TV. And you're able to kind of mine those little tidbits for things that you know are going to become more important in the future.
And part of the process is also, by the discipline of doing it season by season, you had to get the story done in a limited amount of space. That is, you had to say, this is what was going on then. All right, end of this chapter. Let's go to the story again, picking it up in another context. for the next season. And therefore, as you go through watching TV, I like to tell people, well, if you don't care about 1944, if you don't care about 1954, don't start there. Start any place in the book, because you can pick it up any place in that season and read about that season in its context and get a sense of what was going on. Or you can start on page 1 and go all the way to page 500 by now.
Which, of course, the true reader should do, of course.
One of the things that happens now that was not true back when we were doing the research is there was no internet. The internet, in effect, was our access to the Library of Congress. Yes. I mean, that had everything you would want to have all under one roof, plus some visits to the National Archives and other specialty collections in New York City. Yes. We went to as well. And so basically, we were driving the East Coast internet before there was an internet. Following that was we lived in different places, and so we were sort of a prisoner of who's rerunning what episodes of what series from beginning to end, so we can get a sense of a series that played before we were watching.
Well, yeah, obviously, as with many things, the world is completely different now than it was in the late 70s. TV is, of course, hugely different, and the ability to research and look up things has changed markedly, of course. That's an understatement. And so while it was difficult for us to track down some things, we did a pretty good job, I thought. But of course, that's what's so wonderful now, is that now anybody can dig out, not anything, of course, but if you're reading about a show from the past now, you can go look it up or see a clip of it on YouTube or whatever, and which I think is fantastic. And I love it just to be able to see, oh, you know, I remember we said such and such about this show. I wonder if I would really still feel that way. And fortunately, in most cases, when I dig out a clip, I go, yeah, right. No, I think we got it right.
And it makes the joy of television watching something that's very tangible now. That before we would have to try to describe what was going on, then someone can tune in. For instance, I teach at the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC, in the comm department, and I have a history of television and a future TV course. And one of the things about the history of television that's a challenge is to try to engage the students in stuff from the 50s. But you come across some dramas, I'm thinking one in particular of a business drama called Patterns, written by Rod Serling. It still works. I mean, they come in and said, I didn't think I was going to be interested in that, and I was thoroughly involved in it. You see some of the Edward R. Murrow documentaries. Those still pack a punch. They come away going, whoa, Harvest of Shame? Wow. Oh, and that's still going on. But there is engagement that came in those early days of television, which now people have the opportunity to see, and that give a little more flavor to what we've been writing about. They have the examples to check out for themselves. One of the joys now is binge watching.
Yes.
And binge watching is not just, I'm going to spend a weekend locked up and not talk to anybody else, but rather, let me see on fast forward what happened to a show over multiple seasons. And it's then that you start to get a greater feel for how these things are constructed.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, we've just glossed over probably the biggest change that has happened to television since the beginning is, of course, in the beginning, or in the early days of television, the viewer was completely out of the loop. The viewer was controlled by the station schedule, the primetime schedule. Either they happened to be home and watched a show, or that's it. There was no videotape. There may not even have been reruns.
Certainly not for live productions.
Right. And if there were reruns, they weren't on for weeks and weeks and weeks. That, of course, is now completely upside down. Now, because of the ability of DVRs or accessing things through streaming or DVDs, you can watch almost anything you want whenever you feel like watching it. And that is the biggest change in television since the early days. And so the ability to binge watch, to watch marathons on television, if you will, or to create your own binge watching through streaming or DVDs, it's wonderful if you want to. You don't have to do it, but to get that ability to follow a story arc, to see a show change, whatever, is wonderful and allows anybody to kind of get a grasp of the history of that show or what was going on at that time.
And the other thing that by taking a historical perspective, even on the early days of technological choices or programming choices, is you realize that there was that desire, perhaps not articulated by the audience, to do just that. One of the early ventures of syndication would be not just new material created for first-run syndication, but here's I Love Lucy episodes. We're going to run them. We're going to run them in the afternoons. We're going to run them in the evening. We're going to rerun them and rerun them and rerun them, and people like that. So the idea of binge watching starting in the internet age, yes, on fast forward, but it was there as part of the mix for the longest time. And also it sort of set up people to view television as almost like editions of a magazine or books on the shelf where they were all sort of equal. I mean, if you were watching MASH during its first run time, there was a point at which CBS had MASH reruns in the afternoon, MASH reruns in late night, MASH itself in prime time, and if you were a fan of the show, you sort of didn't care which one was the latest one, because all of them were opportunities to visit with MASH.
But of course, the other big change that this kind of more modern binge watching allows, in many cases, is the sort of dirty little secret of the television industry, which was all along the television industry, much like the radio industry before it, was built on the premise that show producers and networks were going to be able to deliver to advertisers a stable set number of eyeballs, of people watching the show. They could guarantee the makers of Palmolive soap that X million people would watch this commercial on this show at this time of the week. And so the advertiser says, okay, fine, based on that assumption, I will give you X dollars to be able to create this program to attract viewers. Well, now that whole bargain has begun to collapse. And people want to be able to zip through commercials that's on their DVR. They don't want to have to sit through and watch them. Or they want to stream things and not have to watch ads. Or they'll pay a little extra to watch something like HBO that doesn't have ads. And so the industry is now at the point of like throwing up its hands and saying, well, what do we do? How do we work this business model? And that, of course, is the part that no one knows the answer to at the moment. We don't know exactly where we're going. We can see that things are changing, but we don't know where it's going.
And in terms of the answer, there are multiple paths, none of which is a certain path.
Right.
And in fact, that's one of the things we grappled with in terms of looking towards the future, is say this, or this, but none is guaranteed.
Yeah.
A pivotal moment, if you're looking back in TV history, I always point to the so-called Betamax case, in which that was the first time that this imprimatur in the mid-1980s was given to home consumers to say, you have a video recorder and you could use it without any problem whatsoever.
And I know we've referred to it that way, but I view it almost slightly differently.
Okay.
In that, to me, and let's explain for those of you at home who don't recall, the Betamax case was when video recorders, there was another form of video recording called Betamax, which was an alternate version, was becoming popular. The TV show producers, the production companies, didn't like the fact that regular home viewers were able to record on their own and keep and show to other people and watch whenever they watch programs that had been broadcast on over-the-air television. And they tried to stop that practice by suing, and it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, that's okay. Now,
it's fair use, basically.
It's fair use under the Copyright Act. But what that meant to me was not so much that people were sweating it out, saying, oh my goodness, I'm afraid the police are going to come in and arrest me and throw my video recorder out the window. What it was that it was for the first time that the law allowed, or that it was granted, that people can create a TV schedule on their own. It was the declaration of independence of the home TV viewer, and saying, I'm going to be able to rip up the TV schedule and record and watch whatever I want whenever I want to. And that, to me, is the importance of the Betamax decision. It's the first break in that chain of slavery that we had to the TV networks. We're able to operate on our own, and of course now you see where we are now.
Well, and the other part of that declaration is that it illustrated that the public was ahead of both the business and, in a way, of the government regulators, saying, this is what we want. You guys figure out how to make it work, because we're going to do it, no matter what you're saying. And that's what actually we're in right now.
Yes.
Is we collectively have figured out what we want television to be. And you know, sometimes we will pay. Sometimes you give us the right package, we're going to pay for it. You give us the right presentation and we'll sign on and subscribe. But we're going to decide that, not you. So you figure out how to make it work.
And as I think we've talked about between ourselves, that's kind of the rough lesson that the music industry has learned and is still in the process of learning, when people just simply, once technologically people were able to download music off the internet, they said, I'm not buying albums anymore. I'm not going to buy singles anymore. I'm going to buy individual songs or get my hands on individual songs. And the music industry, of course, was turned upside down on that and is sort of now started figuring out how to deal with it one way or the other. The TV industry is still in that process of figuring out that people are going to watch or want to watch what they want, when they want to, and how they want to, where they want to, on whatever kind of device they want. And the TV industry is being dragged, kicking and screaming, into trying to figure out how to do that. How does business work in that model? How can we make money under that premise? And I'm sure that they will figure something out that will be acceptable, but we just don't know yet.
I was at a conference in Washington earlier this year in which engineers were specifically talking about what they were doing in the behind the scenes, so to speak, to make the presentation of video seamless, whether you are on a handheld device, whether you are on tuning in via broadcast or cable or what have you. It should all be able to be the same unified experience, and you as the end user shouldn't have to give it a second thought. They're trying to make that work, and there was a graph where they were showing technologically what that involved, and it filled an entire screen, because it's not as easy as it would seem to go from this technology to that technology and mush the two together. But the motivation is pretty high to be able to do it. And you know what? Media CEOs are still among the highest paid in the country. So the business is doing different things, but it's still doing okay.
Well, I had the pleasure when I was in law school to take a course in the broadcast industry law from Sumner Redstone, who is now, of course, basically the owner of CBS. And I got to observe him close up, and I was like, this is a sharp guy. He knows what's going on. And unfortunately, I never did latch on and become his protege. But nonetheless, he's still doing pretty well running CBS. But yeah, as the view of history that we get from this, as I was kind of pointing out in the past, you go through these eras in which you think, well, the status quo is going to last forever.
It's always going to be this way.
ABC, CBS, NBC, that's it. That's all there ever is going to be. And then, of course, that changes. And then it's replaced, and then you have the cable universe, and you think, okay, well, that's what the change is going to be. You're going to have this world of cable television, and that's what it's going to be forever. And now we're seeing that no, that's not the case. In fact, now you're starting to get the feeling that the cable industry may be jeopardized because of the new streaming technology, wireless technology, in which people don't really necessarily need cable companies to get programs.
Fortunately, they'll just go right across the street to the provider of internet service, which in some cases happens to be the same owner as the cable company.
Yes.
Let me ask something that we shared recently, which was there was a binge presentation of The Fugitive, and it ended with one of the most famous conclusions to a TV series, and that was a two-part episode called The Judgment. You were in Boston, I was in Chicago, we were both watching it, and we talked about it afterwards, and this, I think, is an example of what binge watching, historical context, can bring to the appreciation of a drama. Namely, we asked the very simple question, is this really good? Is The Fugitive as good as we remembered? And was this final episode as significant as we thought it was back then? I think we basically concluded yes on all fronts.
Yes, I mean, I know this may be sort of an old fogey talking here, but I loved The Fugitive as a kid. I thought it was a great show. The premise, the doctor wrongly convicted of killing his wife, pursued by the police lieutenant, obsessed with his capture, et cetera, et cetera. It grabbed me as a kid. I loved the ending, seeing the vindication of Dr. Kimball, Richard Jansen, David Jansen. And then seeing it now, I still thought it's a very effective program. Of course, the technology is different, and you look at it and you go, gee, if they only had a cell phone, they could have cured all this problem here. But as a story, I mean, that's the same thing with any kind of story. You read, whatever, War and Peace, something from Dickens. You appreciate, it's about an older era, but it's still a good story. A good story is a good story no matter when it comes from. And to me, and I think to us, The Fugitive is a very effective storyline. The characters are instantly appealing and entertaining and interesting. And just you think of, what would I do if I was in that situation? How would I react? And watching it, I still felt, even though, of course, I knew every little moment of what was going to happen, I got caught up in watching the ending again and seeing him succeed and get vindicated. And I mean, it's a great, they lived happily ever after story. But nonetheless, it was a great series. It was worth the fact that it was the highest rated TV show at that time, and it kept that record for a number of years, I think until MASH. The MASH finale of 81, 83? And The Fugitive ended in 67. And the fact that, I had fallen in love with it at the time, I had recorded it off the television with my, home tape recorder, audio
You're talking about audio only.
Audio only, of course. I had recorded the sound off the TV because I loved it. Anyway, it's still a good show. I still think anybody who spends a little time or wants to watch The Fugitive, it's worth it.
And in particular, the historical context we brought to it was daring at that point to actually end a series.
One of the things that I did not know, I had not heard this story before, but looking at stuff on YouTube, I think, around the time The Fugitive finale ran a couple of weeks ago, I found an interview with one of the top network programmers or executives at ABC, and talking about the genesis of the Fugitive finale. And he was saying that, the show had been on for a number of years, and they were thinking it was about the end of its run, and David Jansen, the star, was getting tired and wanted to...
Because he was in like every scene.
He was in every scene. He wanted to do something else. He was tired of it. And they came up with the idea of actually concluding the series, saying, all right, the whole premise of this series is this guy on the run, avoiding getting captured by the police. Let's do some kind of wrap-up where the story is concluded. And he went to his bosses, and they looked at him like he was crazy and said, well, why would we want to do that? Series didn't do that back then. They just ran until they were canceled, and then they ended, whether they were in the middle of a story or not. They didn't care, because people didn't think of television as being a long-lasting medium. It was a very temporary medium, that it was watched. Maybe the show was rerun once in the summertime, and that was it. It was out the window. They didn't care anymore. And then it was
a perpetual rerun syndication.
An afternoon syndication.
But that was...
Nobody cared about that other than the owners of the show who were making money off the syndicated reruns. And so he had to talk the network brass into saying, no, let's do it turned out a 2-part episode to wrap up the series. And the network really didn't think that people were going to care. What was also fascinating, sorry to focus so much on this series, but of course, like now, most of the shows on network television ended their run in May or whatever. And instead of running the finale in May, they waited, they let The Fugitive run its reruns in the summer, and they ran the two-part finale at the end of August, just before the new season started, when viewership was always down, and yet it still got extremely high ratings at a time when they thought nobody was going to bother to tune in. Well, they did.
And it sort of illustrated a lesson back then that people cared about television. They cared about the characters and they cared about the storytelling, and I think that's something that you and I have always tried to capture and tell back. No matter what era, and we don't say it was only good in the 60s or it was only good in the 80s. No, we love it now as well. And I think I'd like to wrap up with a finale that we've both talked about, which was the Mad Men finale. Because it seems that is an appropriate recognition of one of the strengths of television that is obviously the underpinning of the whole industry, namely ads, the commercials, the people behind them, and then of course the final product that pays for all of the things that we love, the sports and the news and the comedies and the dramas. All of that comes because someone is writing a check because they see that this is a medium to sell. And so when Matt Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, was looking for what is the happiest ending, the best, most satisfying ending that you can come up with for a TV series, he came up with what he did.
And you know, like most, I think, Mad Men viewers, I'm sitting there watching the show as it's getting near its end. I say, well, what's he going to do? What's he doing here? Where is this going?
Where he was at a
like an Esalen Institute retreat in the early 70s, and Don Draper is kind of having a nervous breakdown, whatever. The point being was that at the end, he finally reaches some kind of
moment of zen.
Moment of zen, and that's what was the beauty of Don Draper, in that he could, why he was a successful advertising executive, is because he could kind of channel people's emotions and create advertising that addressed those emotions, that could draw people in. And there he is at this, you know, very early 70s kind of hippie-ish kind of retreat with people doing yoga and chanting Om, and you see the smile on his face, and then they cut to the famous, you know, I'd like to teach the world to sing Coca-Cola commercial with a lot of people of all different races and nationalities on this hilltop singing about Coca-Cola, which in some ways might look funny now to a modern viewer, but that was a very historic commercial because it really was addressing a feeling about people and trying to a new world or whatever, or a more peaceful world, whatever. It was a theme of trying to draw that in with the product of Coca-Cola, which was very unusual, and it didn't have the hard sell that had been so popular up until then. It was more of a soft sell that became kind of a model for advertising for years to come after that.
It was the joy of television. It was the joy of commercialism. It was the joy of singing, the joy of people. It was a joyful ending.
And it was showing, to be honestly, how in its best, you know, art and commerce can coexist when it's done correctly.
And to wrap up here, currently the Museum of Broadcast Communication has a special display of 10 advertising icons. We have a new Paul Lisnick gallery where we have the artifacts, videos, timelines, clips, etc. And watching people go into that room is almost like connecting with the people on that Coca-Cola hillside. They really enjoy this part of the television story. This part of the television story are the ads that cross all generations, cross all eras. All the icons on that display are still active. They're still part of the sales pitches of these companies. And it's fun.
When I got my first glimpse of it just recently, when I saw it, it immediately struck me, that same feeling. You know, we were talking about how we are, in our book, trying to show the value of the common, the popular programs, why they are just as important as the industry trends and the broadcasting trends. And a part that we frankly didn't focus on very much was the advertising. And you look at that and you say, there are great stories here.
That's a book in itself.
It's a book in itself. These are ads that connected with people. again tying in with the Mad Men thing, a successful advertising strategy, whether you love it or hate it, gets into your head and addresses something that you're thinking and becomes a fond or perhaps a negative memory when you look back, but it's part of your life. And that's what television is to a lot of people. It's reflective of their life, the life in the country, and it shows it, and that's why looking back at it is important.
Well, Harry Castleman, thank you so much for sharing observations about what led to watching TV, 6 decades of American television, and a long collaborative career with you.
Well, thank you, Wally, and thanks for all your help, and I've really enjoyed working with you over the years.
For the Museum of Broadcast Communication, I'm Walter Podrazik.